Good afternoon. My name is Marcos Breton. I'm a columnist with the Sacramento Bee, and welcome to our forum on homelessness. Homelessness is an issue that we are all facing acutely. We see it, we live it every day, and the question is what to do about it, and can our city reverse the course of the last several years when we've seen a huge uptick in homelessness? And who better to discuss that with than Mayor Darrell Steinberg, who is not only our mayor who has made homelessness a central issue in his term, but he was appointed by Governor Gavin Newsom to lead a statewide effort on homelessness. So, Mayor, welcome to
Thank you for having me.
So let's go right into it because there's a lot of ground to cover. So I'm going to read you a question, and then we'll begin from that. So addressing homelessness was one of your primary issues when you ran for mayor. You cited the number of 2,000 people who you initially wanted to house, and you have met that. But our homeless population grew anyway. You said you wanted to be judged by the eyeball test. If the average citizen could see a noticeable difference in the number of homeless people on our streets, well, it's gotten worse. What happened?
Well, it is a longer-term agenda and a longer-term challenge than I would wish, to be honest with you. Sacramento is not alone. Cities throughout the entire state of California are seeing even larger increases in homelessness. And our recent point-in-time count, which measured from essentially the time I became mayor to now, was really interesting. On the one hand, it was sobering, a 19% increase. And I don't believe that I've passed that eyeball test yet. You're right, because people are still absolutely feeling it. At the same time, the report showed an 8% decrease in chronic unsheltered homelessness. And what's the difference? The difference appears to be that the issues of housing affordability have become even more intense, not just in Sacramento, but throughout all of California, who again are seeing similar or even larger increases. And so we've housed 3,600 people. I talked about 2,000, but you know me well enough to know that I'm far from satisfied. We have a lot of work left to do, yet I think the chronic homeless numbers, the fact that we put in place whole person care and showed that low barrier triage can actually work, shows that if we continue and elevate what we've done, that we'll see better numbers.
So I want to get to some of the points that you just addressed, but let's get started on that 3,600 figure, because it's hard to quantify, right, and to sort of break into pieces. And then some of our journalists have done some digging on that front and found that HUD and some of the local nonprofits have been housing some of those numbers for years. But the city's big experiment, for example, at Railroad Road, had you tell me the number. It was a couple of hundred people.
264 people.
At a cost of about $400,000 a month to operate that facility, which worked out to upwards to $6 million. And give or take, it was basically about 30,000 people, $30,000 per person to be housed. That's crazy, isn't it?
I don't think it is. When you think about the people who we served out of that Railroad Avenue shelter, people who had been homeless for more than a decade, one veteran who had been homeless for 40 years, people who were the sickest of the sick, to get them off the streets, to provide them with the intensive mental health and substance abuse services and the wraparound that is the only thing we know that works to help people reclaim their lives. The fact that hundreds of people have been able to move into longer-term housing and gained their stability, I think that's an investment well worth it. What is the alternative? And, we never talk about.
So what is the alternative? So, for example, like when I saw the 30,000 figure, I was like, whoa. And I think if you speak to the layperson, they see it as well. But every time I've mentioned that figure to you, you don't even blink. So I would begin by asking, why does it cost so much? What's the major driver in terms of the cost for the 30,000 per person?
Well, first of all, these are people who are sick, most of them, and who need intensive amounts of support and services. And it costs money, a lot of money, actually, to have the right provider with the right training actually manage a low barrier triage shelter that includes 100 to 200 people. But it's the acuity of the people that we're talking about. It's that they have hit such rock bottom that in order to have any opportunity for them to potentially reclaim their lives, that they that you have to put a lot into it. So $30,000 over the course of the year, I think about the amounts of money we spend from our police budget, from our fire service budget, responding to all the 911 calls, the amount of cleanup that it takes to clean up the sidewalks and the riverbanks, that's tens of millions of dollars. Mm-hmm. And so to me, these are worthy investments if we want to solve the problem. Mm-hmm. And look, I've never said we can cure it, but I've said we can make it better. And I've said there are two tests. Number one, can we get thousands of people off the streets by applying what we know works? Intensive outreach, not giving up on someone just because they say they don't want treatment. Intensive case management, mental health and substance abuse services, low barrier triage shelter, and longer term housing. If we can apply those principles, we can get thousands of people off the streets, and we will. We already have. But there's another test, and that's the eyeball test. And that's one that cities throughout all of California are still grappling with.
So I want to focus on one piece that you just mentioned there in terms of what we're doing in Sacramento is beyond what some of your council colleagues want to do. Some of your council colleagues want to only focus on those who want to be helped. And we're attempting, and you correct me if I'm wrong, we're attempting in Sacramento to try to help people who are in a desperate situation in their lives for a variety of reasons. And so what we're doing is we're spending great resources on them. But I ask this question because I know a very prominent elected official in our region who has a family member who is living on the river. And this young person comes from a very prominent family and had every advantage in the world and became addicted to drugs. And for all the efforts that the family of this person have invested in, up to and including having this young person steal things from them when they take him in, this person wants to be on the river and doesn't want any help. And it's what I have found in writing about homelessness in Sacramento is that the homeless advocates don't want to talk about this aspect of it because it makes people feel uncomfortable. So don't we, as a city, have an obligation to the rest of our residents to say, if you don't want help, then you can't be here?
Yes. That's an opportunity for me to say something that I want to say to the people of Sacramento, but also now under my guise and umbrella of being the statewide co-chair of Governor Newsom's Homeless Task Force. Mark Ridley Thomas, the county supervisor from Los Angeles, who's my co-chair, he and I are putting forward a proposal today that calls on the state of California.
What, you're making news right now?
I'm making news. You want me to make news? Let's make news. Calling on the state of California to do two things that we've never done before. Number one is to declare a statewide right to shelter.
Like New York does.
Like New York does. 95% of New York's homeless population is indoors. Now, there's been criticism of the New York model because people stay in shelters for too long, but we can learn from their experience. We can put limits and incentives to move people into more permanent housing. But the right to shelter, and here's why it's so crucial. In my opinion, Marcos, we have lost the proverbial forest through the trees. We are so focused on the 10-year plan to fix homelessness, on the drive to build more permanent supportive housing. A lot of this has been my life's work. Prop 63 and No Place Like Home, the housing offshoot. I believe in it, and I believe that it's ultimately where we need to get people. But in the meantime, we have sort of tacitly accepted as a society that it's okay for people to live under bridges, on the riverbank, and on the streets while we, quote, fix the problem. Yeah. Guess what? It's not working. I'm not done yet. And I know this is a conversation. There is a second half to this proposal. Yeah. And it's just as important. And people might be surprised given my politics and my history to hear this. Mark Ridley Thomas and I are calling for a legal obligation for people to come inside and to take shelter. Now, we cannot enforce that until we actually implement the right to shelter and create the capacity. But until there is a prod that says we are going to bring people indoors and we're going to invest what it takes to do so. New York City shelters 75,000 people a year for $1.6 billion. Our unsheltered homeless population in California is estimated to be about 90,000. So a little bit more, but relatively comparable. $1.6 billion statewide to get tens of thousands of people off the streets and to clean up our streets and to deal with the frustration that people have. We cannot wait for the long-term housing strategy of the state of California to take effect and to be implemented before we get people inside. And then, by the way, it's much harder to bring people into permanent housing until and unless they are inside. We must have a right to shelter, and we've got to get around all this 5150 laws and all the things that make it difficult to...
but what do we do for the person that, like I mentioned?
You make them come inside.
If they refuse?
You look at what 5150 says is that you can conserve...
You can explain to the audience.
Okay, I'm very sorry. Okay. 5150 is the law passed back in the 60s when we shut the state mental hospitals.
Right.
Which the whole idea of deinstitutionalization was to allow people to live with dignity on the streets.
Yes.
In their communities, not on the streets.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was a Freudian slip.
Freudian slip.
To live with dignity in their communities. And the problem is the system was never funded to provide them supports. That's why I did Prop 63 back in 2004. But the law also says that if people are deemed a danger to themselves or others, that they can be conserved and brought in. Now, the law has been largely...
Why hasn't that happened?
It's been a mess. Because, one, there haven't been enough services. Two, there has not been a commitment for the homeless population to bring people indoors. And three, it has been interpreted in vastly disparate ways across the state. And the legislature, in part to its credit, has tried to reform it on a number of occasions. It's never gone anywhere. I want to step outside of 5150 because I'm not talking about that. It's a morass. Instead, what I'm saying here is that once we have the capacity to provide shelter, that we enforce the law that says you cannot live outside. Okay. And this is what the courts have essentially told us, too. You know, the famous Boise decision, I get a lot of concerning complaints from residents who say, why aren't you...
Let's explain that to people, because a lot of people don't understand that. You can't just move people, right? The courts have said that they have to be able to go somewhere.
Right. So the most common complaint I get as mayor, and I know my council colleagues get it as well, is why aren't you busting up tent encampments that adjoin the neighborhoods? And by the way, we do some of that enforcement and move people along, especially when we can show health and safety violations or catch somebody selling drugs. But in most instances, when you can't find that, what the Boise decision says, unless the city can demonstrate that it has sufficient shelter capacity to be able to offer that individual a bed, that we cannot bust the encampment. And so in part, one of the keys to giving us the ability to clean up the mess is to actually provide shelter capacity. So it's a right to shelter, and it's an obligation to take shelter.
So let's reset here. My name is Marcos Breton. I'm a columnist with the Sacramento Bee, and we're here with Mayor Darrell Steinberg, and we're talking about homelessness in our community and in our state. We have some questions from the audience, and why don't I read one of them now? So this is one of those questions that you've had to deal with. Why don't the city police enforce laws and on public intoxication or drugs anymore?
Well, first of all, they do. I mean, in Land Park just last week, our police basically shut down a meth house and arrested a meth house
in Land Park,
right on the edge of the freeway there. Yes, and this house was reputed to be the place where a lot of the meth addicts were buying their meth and camping along Broadway and under the freeway. And so the police are enforcing the law. And when they see violations of the law, they are actually pretty assertive about it, and appropriately so. The dilemma is around the encampments themselves. And until we provide the shelter capacity, we cannot, by law, in most instances, remove those encampments.
So let's talk about your plan for our city.
For our city,
okay. So let me see if I distill this correctly.
Okay.
Your plan relies on the assumption that we are able to move homeless people through triage shelters in a matter of months. But the Railroad Road shelter didn't see that, right? I mean, people stayed much longer. So what makes us think that it will be different going forward?
Well, first of all, some people stayed longer, and some people we were able to reconnect with families and get housed sooner than that. And so the idea is an average of 4 to 6 months.
So what was the difference between the two? What was sort of the people who stayed longer, what was going on with them?
They have more chronic illnesses. They're the more severely mentally ill. They have been out on the streets longer. They're people who have resisted treatment. One of the things that we've done, of course, let me explain, if I might, what the program here is. On Railroad Avenue, for the first time in the city, we built what we call low barrier triage.
And that means that
3 Ps: pets, possessions, and partners.
All welcome.
All welcome, because what we know is that the biggest impediment to people who are chronically homeless for a long time coming in are that you traditionally can't bring your pets. You can't come in with your partner, and you can't bring your big haul of whatever it is you carry around with you. We changed that. And so we were able to actually bring people in who had been resistant to coming in, again, for a decade or longer in some instances. So we want to do similar shelters. We're starting in August, by the way, so it's just around the corner, at the Capitol Park Hotel at 9th and L. Now, this may be a little different than the traditional low barrier triage because it's actually rooms. So I don't know whether they're going to be able to accommodate pets or not,
yeah.
but the general philosophy is going to be the same. Larry Carr and I are going out to Meadowview on August the 12th.
I'm laughing because Larry Carr he's a city councilman in Sacramento, has not exactly been on board.
He has a bit of a different point of view, but he's a good man.
He is a good man.
And he and I are going to go out together to Meadowview to talk about the potential siting of a South Area shelter. And by the way, we're making unprecedented investments in Meadowview as a result of Measure U. And it's only the beginning of what we're going to do to try to uplift not only that area of our city, but other similar areas that have been disadvantaged for a long time. But we need a South Area site. So August 12th, we're going out together in front of the community, and I'm going to, Larry doesn't have to make the case. I'm going to make the case, okay?
Along with making the case, and you and I have talked about this before. So here's one of the things that one of my beefs about this is that when we do place shelters in Sacramento, they're always in Meadowview or North Sacramento or in a poor neighborhood. They ain't going to be in my neighborhood or your neighborhood or the Fabulous 40s or some of the more well-heeled. And it's been my experience that some of the wealthier people in our community yell the loudest about this issue, but they don't have it anywhere near where they live. So can you address having to deal with that?
I think that's a fair observation and a fair criticism. Look, at Capitol Park Hotel, 9th and L is the heart of downtown. Mm-hmm. And so we're trying to break that mold, if you will. Part of the maddening challenge, and it has been a challenge, is to identify sites that are large enough, that are paved, that are ready for us to put what we call a sprung shelter, which is the military-style tent, or a warehouse. And warehouses don't exist in many neighborhoods in the city. One of my mindsets here, and I think I'm confident it is absolutely the right thing, is that we could do a lot of scattered sites throughout all the neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. And the county is doing that, and to their credit, I think it's a good thing. The problem with scattered site is that it is insufficient because you can't get to the volume of people that we want to serve. So what if we did scattered site in every neighborhood, but we only were able to open 100 beds by virtue of buying 20 homes? Okay, that would satisfy the concern that people have about fair share, but we wouldn't be dealing with the volume. And one of the things I'm calling for, both in my local role obviously as mayor, and why we're pursuing this direction. And at the state level, one of the reasons I'm calling for the right to shelter and obligation to take shelter is because we have got to deal with the volume. I call it, and it sounds derisive, and I don't mean it to, but I call it the ribbon-cutting mentality. We sort of satisfy ourselves as a community by cutting a ribbon when we open a 15-bed complex for the homeless. And the people, by the way, who are providing the service and doing the project, they're heroes to me and heroines. But for us as government, it's not enough to cut the ribbon and say 15 beds. We've got to deal with volume. So let me finish what the idea here is. It's not perfect, but if we saw an 8% decrease in chronic unsheltered homeless, I think we can see a bigger decrease next time. Here's why. We've got Capitol Park. We're going to have a South Area shelter, and again, we're going out to the community August 12th. We're working with Cal Expo, Ethan Way. We've got, it's a struggle, but it's a whole nother, it could be a whole nother podcast here. That's 100.
And the neighbors fight
100 beds,
right?
Yes, and we've got working with Jay Chenier on the
City Councilman Jay
Chenier with Caltrans is being very cooperative on a site under the freeway.
Yes.
Okay, so if we can get to 500 beds, 400 to 500 beds, and then
in what period of time are you hoping?
You know, this
500 beds throughout.
This is where I get caught because it's never as fast as I want it to be. But certainly, you know, by the beginning of 2020, we got to be up and running with all of this stuff, okay? And some of it's going to be up and running now, Capitol Park in August. Right. But that's not all. We have existing shelter beds that the city helps fund, about 160 of them. We're in the process of repurposing those beds now. They've been long-term shelter. We're going to repurpose them to intensive case management, support services, triage shelter. You start adding up the numbers, you get to 600-700. If we're moving people out every 4 to 6 months, which I think we can do because we're learning from the model at Railroad Avenue, you begin to then get into four figures in terms of 1,000, 2,000 people that you can move through every year. And then we have the long-term housing problem on the other end.
Right.
Measure U, we're setting aside $100 million to create a housing trust fund here. That's the beginning.
So this is Marcos Breton. I'm a columnist with the Sacramento Bee, and we're honored to be here with Mayor Darrell Steinberg as we're talking homelessness. So let's take another question from one of our viewers. Okay, so security near a low-barrier shelter, such as the proposed Alhambra X location, is a major neighborhood concern. This locality already has large camps with assaults, fires, garbage, needles, etc. Why doesn't the city put security in place now at such locations to show residents that the city will be able to maintain order with the eventual shelter?
Well, we are spending millions of dollars on our police impact teams to provide as much security and law enforcement presence as we can. We're putting a lot of money through our public works department to actually clean up the messes as quickly as we can. But the questioner, I think, raises a very important point. Homelessness is no longer just a downtown issue, right? It's South Sacramento, it's North Sacramento, it's obviously under the freeway. And so our obligation to the people who live in and around a shelter is to target our outreach to the homeless population that is already plaguing their neighborhood or their business corridor. And to provide security, absolutely, but more than security, to provide ongoing cleanup crews, to make sure that we provide all the mitigations that are necessary. You talk to the folks out at Railroad Avenue, and here's what they will tell you. The Woodlake community was viscerally opposed to this, and we know it, and we went through the gauntlet, and Jeff Harris and Alan Warren both did a great job in terms of standing tough with me, and we got it done. By the end, talk to Andy Hernandez, the president of the Woodlake Neighborhood Association. He will tell you that it was a success, that it made things better for the neighborhood because the outreach was focused out there, and we had the security and the mitigation. The thing about these shelters, I want to be clear about this, these are not drop-in shelters. People have got to be, quote, referred through assertive outreach, and then brought to the shelter. So there's not going to be long queues or long lines. And again, the test will be, just like in North Sacramento, did we improve homelessness in the area where the shelter is built? That has to be a commitment.
So let's talk about some of the drivers that are driving people to homelessness. And so I would ask, and you can speak to this because it's been, as you said, it's been your life's work. So, Mayor, at this point, can we just admit that letting so many people out of the jails alleviated a statewide problem, but created local ones, like in cities of Sacramento?
I think it created local challenges. There's no question about it. We have to admit and acknowledge that. But I think people often forget the first part, which is that the state was under federal court order for a decade to reduce its overcrowded prisons, in part because during periods of recent California history back in the 70s and 80s and even in the 90s, we got, quote, tough on crime. And as a result, the taxpayers footed a huge bill and our prisons were overcrowded. And so, and in 2009, we faced these terrible budget deficits, which was part of my experience as pro tem of the Senate. And so, yes, realignment was in part budget-driven and in part driven by the fact that the federal courts told us you can't keep your prisons as crowded as they are. So now how do we deal with it? I hear this complaint a lot, and I get it, and I listen to it, and I acknowledge it. But you know what? Even prior to Prop 47 or even prior to realignment, there were not nearly enough treatment slots for people who are addicted to drugs. We know that the mental health system, despite the infusion of $2.4 billion a year of Prop 63, still is inaccessible to a lot of people. And so it's not just the changes in the law, which were a result of budget deficits and prison overcrowding. It's that we've never built up the infrastructure to say, how do we help these people once they're in jail or once they're in drug treatment? That's still where we need to focus.
So, Mayor, do you think we're going to wake up one day and realize that we were obsessing about a homeless crisis when in reality it's been an addiction crisis all along?
It's both. I mean, the most chronic, so let's distinguish why this is so complicated. It is not a singular population that we're talking about here. For the chronic homeless, addiction and mental health are the key drivers. If you weren't addicted or mentally ill when you became homeless, it's sure more likely you're going to become addicted or mentally ill if you're on the streets for a long time. So for that population, it is an addiction crisis and a mental health crisis, but the bottom line to me remains the same, and this is where I disagree with some of the residents of the city who are so vocal. Until you get those people inside, even if you have to make them come inside, you can't treat their addiction. The frustration is completely understandable and real, but what's your solution?
Yeah.
We've got to bring them inside. The other piece of it, though, that we cannot forget is that the increasing numbers of homeless, not just in Sacramento, but in our state, that is largely about housing affordability. And that's a whole nother topic.
That's exactly the point I want to get to.
Okay.
But first, I need to reset. This is Marcos Breton. I'm a columnist for the Sacramento Bee. We're honored to be here with Mayor Darrell Steinberg talking homelessness. Let's take another question from one of our viewers today. What percentage of homeless suffer from mental illness and could benefit from long-term institutional services? Can the city work with the county to create alternative sentencing programs to tackle drug abuse?
Well, the latest point-in-time count, I think, said about 20% of the counted population is mentally ill. I think that's probably understated. That is my opinion. Yeah. But again, you know, the point-in-time count gets a lot of attention, and rightfully so. But it's a two-day count.
Two-day count,
and it's imperfect. And
they
did great.
Like about 10% of the people who actually counted actually took the survey.
Yeah, they do. The Sac State and Sacramento Steps Forward did a great job, but it still is an imperfect instrument. So whatever that number is. So here's one of the, I never pass the buck because it's never the right thing to do, but I just want to explain to the viewers, the city is not a Health and Human Services agency.
There is that.
Well, it's a big deal.
Yeah.
Right? Proposition 60, the Mental Health Services Act, all the Health and Human Services money, it comes through the county. And so the city is obviously the largest city within the county.
Right.
But only 2 out of 5 supervisors represent the city. That is real.
Hasn't the county's effort been woefully inadequate? Putting aside those 2 supervisors who represent, and they are on board, but are the rest of the ones, aren't they just completely indifferent to what we are experiencing?
No, I'm not going to say that they're indifferent at all. Look, they're all caring people, but they're a different institution and a different culture, and the majority of them do not represent the city, and that's just a fact.
Right.
And I often joke that if I had known I was going to run for mayor of Sacramento 15 years ago, I might have written Prop 63 and all these other laws a little bit differently. But it's actually a drive. I also chair the Big 13 mayors, the big city mayors. We've made a drive over the last 2 budget cycles in California to get money directly for the cities.
But you had to get the kicking and screaming to go along.
Well, this was 2 years ago when I asked the county for $44 million of Prop 63 money. Irony that I had to work so hard to get it because it was my...
They all got mad.
It was my work and vision. They got mad at me. Some of them are still mad at me. And we got the resource. Now they're being put to use. I want to tell you something, though. There's things that are a little different there now. They brought in some new people, some key people, who I would say that the relationship between the city and county has improved. If the scale is 1 to 100, I think we've improved 75% since that fight back in 2017.
Guy, though.
I'm a glass 1/4 full.
So
yes.
On the subject of drivers of homelessness, I want to revisit one of the statistics that was most cited in the point-in-time count. And the point-in-time count, for those who don't know, was it took place in early January over one night, right? It was one night or 2 nights.
2 nights.
2 nights.
2 nights.
Where volunteers fanned out across the county counting the homeless population. And one of the most cited statistics was that 93% of our county homeless population are from Sacramento. And it should be noted, and I have told on myself in this way that in previous columns I had doubted, I had thought that we had become a magnet for homelessness, and a lot of people feel that way. And so this 93% figure, I think, was welcomed by a lot of people because they felt like it debunked a myth about homelessness in Sacramento, and so they were feeling good about that. But the more that we sort of discussed this figure at the Sacramento Bee, we thought, okay, let's think about that for a second. 93% of our homeless population is from Sacramento. Doesn't that mean that we've created a culture here in Sacramento to where people can't afford to live and they're out on the street, and that that somehow that little nuance has been overlooked by people, that we're a city where people can't afford to live.
That 93% number is nothing to celebrate. It's a call to action. And yet, let's just step back for a moment, and if I might, a couple of points. Number one, it does defy the stereotype that a lot of critics of our approach have said that, by building up more services and building these triage centers and doing whole person care and fighting for the mental health dollars, you're bringing more homeless people into Sacramento. Not true. It's not true. And by the way, Sacramento is not alone here. I always said to people, maybe a little sarcastically, if my work is bring more homeless people into Sacramento, then San Francisco's work must be bringing a lot of Sacramentans to San Francisco, because it goes both ways. But aside from that, people forget, in the point in time count in the 2 years before I became mayor, the homeless increase was 85%. So the rate's 19, 8% reduction in chronic homelessness. Not good enough by any means. No celebration. But I think we have put in place the fundamentals to actually bring those numbers in a very, very different direction. And yes, it's not just homelessness among people who are homeless. Let's remember this. There are people now living in our community who are fragile, and housed who are at risk of becoming fragile and homeless. At the state level and locally, we need to focus as much attention on prevention and early intervention as we do on getting people off the streets. That's part of the eyeball test. We're getting thousands off the street, and yet the numbers keep growing. And so people don't see the difference. Housing affordability is a real issue. We've been fighting about rent control in this city for the last year and a half. We're finally creating the capital to build more supportive housing and more low-income housing. We're getting more help from the state than we've ever gotten before. But this is our big task ahead. How do we build more housing?
So let's stay on those numbers for a second, because it can get confusing. So we've housed 3,600 people in your term as mayor, give or take. We've seen a surge in homelessness despite that. So let's I think we both, for the purposes of the audience, we should both acknowledge that we have to take the numbers with a grain of salt on all fronts.
On all fronts.
That though it's the best that we have, the point in time count is far from definitive. And even the point that you celebrated earlier, the point of a drop in chronic homelessness, the study said that they don't have enough data to fully account for why that is. We're hoping that it's some of the efforts that you have led, but we don't know for sure.
We don't.
We don't know for sure. Okay. So having said that, then clearly I went into journalism because I'm not a numbers person. But the numbers don't make sense to me in that if we're housing thousands of people and yet we have thousands more, somewhere in there, it seems like we're creating homeless people in Sacramento, right? If they're from here, then we have something that's going on here that's creating people to go from being fragile to being on the streets, and we don't know for sure. We don't have data for sure. So, what do you think is causing that? Is causing people to?
I think a lot of people are living on the edge, and a lot of people are living in a very fragile way. Either with their own disabilities, or economically, they're having a very difficult time making it. And whether it's a broken down car or an unanticipated medical expense or an unfair rent increase, it's easy to go from fragile and housed to fragile and unhoused. And that's what I think we're seeing more of. And we've got to grapple with it as seriously as what it takes to actually get people who are homeless off the streets.
And I want to expand on that point in a second, but let's reconnect here. This is Marcos Breton. I'm a columnist with the Sacramento Bee, and we're honored to be here with Mayor Darrell Steinberg. We're talking homelessness, and we have a question from Kay Rogers. And Kay Rogers asks, there are many churches, community groups, and nonprofits ready to help that are not part of the whole person care team or funding stream. Where is their place in this discussion?
Well, our faith communities have always and consistently done a great job, both being advocates for the city and county to take more aggressive action, but also as direct providers. The Winter Sanctuary program for years has been a program where churches or synagogues or mosques for a week at a time, for example, or several days at a time, will house 100 or more homeless people in their gymnasiums or in parts of their congregation. And thank God that they do that. But what I would say to them is that it is unfair for us as a society and as government to put all the burden on them, because it's a monumental task for a small religious organization to do this more than, say, a couple of nights in a row. They step up in huge ways. But this is up to society. It's up to the government to actually provide the resources, the infrastructure, the shelter, and the services that will allow us to get many more people off the streets.
So don't you think, and I would include myself, my previous self, my Marcos Breton of 4 years ago in this group of people who are ignorant in terms of what we're up against, not just in Sacramento, but in California. I had a gentleman who tweeted me a photograph of his foot next to a hypodermic needle on his property. And his tweet was like, "This is an outrage." And if he's watching right now, my response to him is, "Where you been, dude? Honestly, we've been living this for some time." So, are we at a point where we're still, as a community, ignorant of what we're really dealing with in terms of homelessness?
I think we're less so, because I think more people are seeing it and feeling it and experiencing it, which is why I get back, some problems are so complicated.
Well, let's talk about the obstacles.
Okay, but I would say some problems are so complicated that we sometimes don't step back and say, what could we be doing differently that might bring us a different result? We sometimes complicate simple ideas. And the simple idea that I'm going to repeat to you, because I think it is the direction that we have to go, is we have got to bring people indoors as a legal right and as an obligation. Until we are clear that that's our first obligation, we are not going to deal with the in a successful way, the numbers of people who are drug addicted, who are mentally ill, and who find, or families who find themselves living in conditions that are inhumane, unhealthy, and unsafe. And so I want to get back to the essence of it, because that to me is the essence of it. We're going to continue to house a lot of people, but will it be better? Not unless we make a commitment to actually getting people off our streets and our riverbanks.
So if I would ask you, what are the biggest obstacles to doing to implementing the programs to make a difference in this issue? What would they be?
Well, I mean, again, let me just take the new idea that I have put out here. The obstacles are there is no statewide requirement to do what I say. It's really optional. And we're all living with the result. I'm not saying that it's all a state responsibility. It's local responsibility, too. By the way, I think Gavin Newsom, new governor, has put his money where his mouth is in terms of the first budget. He's committed to this issue, and I know he wants fundamental and systemic change here. $1.6 billion, New York, to shelter 75,000 people. That's a lot of money. But it really isn't a lot of money when you consider what we're spending on the problem now. And when you think about the levels of frustration, you think about it this way. I mean, think about it from a moral perspective. How do we react when people become unhoused because of natural disasters, because of wildfires, because of earthquakes? Are you kidding me? We rally. State declares emergencies. We get people housed, and we make sure that they stay housed.
Those folks are sympathetic to people, whereas I think with homeless, a lot of people
I understand why, but we all are living the impact of our failure to acknowledge that while we try to, quote, solve the problem, we are mostly okay with people living on the sidewalks, living on the riverbanks, living under the bridges. And until we acknowledge that and change that, we're going to make a lot of progress. I think we can bend the curve in Sacramento, but the problem, you can't really help people until they're under a roof instead of under a bridge.
Well, and you can't help people until you have a place to put them. So if the courts are preventing us from breaking up camps because we don't have enough housing, we need to ask what's the gap between the amount of housing that we need and the amount of housing that we have?
Well, there's a huge gap. I mean, Governor Newsom has talked about 350,000, might be 3.5 million. I forget. He's talked about building a lot of units over his...
Just focusing on Sacramento, what's the gap? Between the permanent supportive housing that we have and what we need? Well,
in terms of for the people who are unsheltered and homeless, the point-in-time count tells us that, the number is about 70% of 5,500. So whatever that is, it's in the thousands. right, in order to house people. Here's another thing. We have got to be more creative about how we think about affordable housing. You know, the average cost to build a permanent supportive housing unit in California, including Sacramento, public subsidy is $400,000 to $500,000. We're not going to get to the volume that we need with that kind of subsidy. I tried to get 1,000 tiny homes started here in Sacramento, and it didn't happen, and I've realized why. Because the whole model is based upon conventional housing, tax credits, the money that flows through our housing authorities, all for conventional housing. There's no financial incentive to try to take a subsidy and to actually build a 350 square foot unit that's dignified, that has that allows somebody to come inside instead of, you know, at $100,000 or $200,000 a unit instead of $400,000 to $500,000 per unit. We've got to look at our whole housing subsidy plan and the way we do it and change it.
How? So part of what's hamstringing us is that we need to move more quickly on getting this housing. Water is a good idea. So we need to move more quickly. It's moving way too slow. But how can we make it move more quickly than, for example, like the Environmental Quality Act shuts everything down? And so as part of a statewide endeavor,
there's a bill in the legislature right now that's moving through by Senator Caballero from the Central Valley, which says that for any housing projects funded under this No Place Like Home initiative, which is the initiative that we worked out through my institute, $2 billion for permanent supportive housing for the homeless, mentally ill, that housing can be built, quote, by right, without having to go through all the regulatory process. That will help a lot. Same with shelters. But look at the reality here. Here's the catch-22. Number one, I have limited authority and powers, as you've written and know about in this job as mayor. I think I'm a strong mayor, but I use my powers of my. I do bring it up, but here's where it's relevant. I can't place a shelter in South Sacramento without going through all of the appropriate community outreach, listening to the concerns of the community, taking them into account, working with my colleagues, bringing it to the council and getting the necessary votes, hopefully with Councilmember Carr and Councilmember Jennings and their support along the way. Yeah, it is hard to implement executive action in the time frame that I would like. So I've got to take both the long view and show a sense of urgency. And we did Railroad, Capitol Park in August. We're working, you know, very aggressively with Caltrans on the freeway site. And then we're going out August 12th with Councilmember Carr to talk to the good people of Meadowview about many things, including the potential of locating a triage shelter out in that area.
So I want to go with you when we do the forum in the fabulous 40s to put a homeless shelter there.
I would love it. But first find a site.
Exactly.
First find a site.
Yeah, lucky.
Find a site that's paved. You know what? I have no hesitation. None. I have no hesitation in any way to go out to any neighborhood and make the case. I need a site that is large enough for 100 to 200 people, that is relatively paved so that you can put up the right structure, or has an existing building or an existing warehouse. Happy to do it.
So I'm Marcos Breton. I'm a columnist with the Sacramento Bee, and this is our forum on homelessness with, do people still call you the Honorable? The Honorable?
When I was out of office, they called me the formerly Honorable.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So
I'm the Honorable. No.
I think it's only fair to go to a question from one of our viewers. Julie asks, how does the mayor feel about transitional housing programs like the one at Mater?
When I talk about right to shelter, an obligation to take shelter, it's not just the warehouse-like shelter that we did on Railroad Avenue. It also includes transitional housing. anything that is going to be a bridge between people living under the bridge and people getting into longer-term housing, I'm for. And I've talked to the Volunteers of America about the Mather project and about some of the financing issues. And we're going to work to do all we can to save those beds, because we need those beds. We can't afford to lose any more beds. We need to go the other way and gain more beds. I'm in favor of transitional housing because it's very similar to the shelter concept that I'm talking about. We got to get people indoors.
So, what would you say has been your greatest frustration in tackling this issue?
Well, I think it's twofold. One is what we've talked about, is the pace. Is the pace of being able to take a vision, and it is a vision, to create 500 to 800 low barrier triage beds, and combine that with the assertive outreach through whole person care, and to have people to begin to feel the impact. I'm not saying the results are what matter, but look at what we've done in the last couple of years. I brought $64 million to Sacramento, the only city other than San Francisco, which is a city and county, to get that kind of money for outreach. I've brought tens of millions of dollars through my work as a Big 13 mayor through the state budget for homelessness. We've set aside $20+ million at City General Fund for homelessness. And we've raised a lot of private money, including from the healthcare systems. And so we've brought the resources to the table. Most of them are not yet out there because we've got to build these other facilities before we're able to actually put the money into good use. So it's been the pace. I want it to be faster, and I'm pushing faster. The second thing is the reality that other mayors and that the whole state is facing, that while we are getting thousands of people off the streets, as promised, that they're being replaced by the next cohort and more.
Mm-hmm. So, along those lines, before you became mayor, it was a major focal point of my column to write about how important it was to get Golden One Center, which is one block from where we're sitting right now. And we've seen a real renaissance in downtown. And there's building, construction. My housing value has gone up, and I certainly have benefited that as someone who's owned for 20+ years in Sacramento. But isn't our prosperity kind of driving the homelessness? And don't we run the risk of becoming like San Francisco, Seattle, where we're all captivated by our wins, and the wins are important, but at the same time it's raising the rents and raising housing prices and driving more people into homes. So
you have a mayor that is doing his level best, and I think with many good results so far, who ran on a platform and continues to implement what I call an inclusive economic development. We have got to continue the excitement and the renaissance of Sacramento, but it's only half or less a victory for our community and for our city if the benefits of all that excitement and growth are not extended to the neighborhoods. This has been the big fight about Measure U, and it was a real fight this last spring, as you witnessed. We raised a second half cent, $50 million. And I said, I want that money to go into the neighborhoods for job creation, for affordable housing, to revitalize our rundown commercial corridors for young people. And I was met with a lot of resistance. We won. And now we're going down that direction. Can I turn around any neighborhood in 1 year or 2 years when we just passed this measure last November? I'm planting a lot of seeds in this job. On the homeless front, on the neighborhood front, on the economic development front, on the economic renaissance front. Look at the work we're doing on the waterfront and with the rail yards. And it is going to take time before I think people see the impact of all of the different things and all the different investments that we have now set in place that are only beginning. You're darn right. I did not run for this office merely to preside over just the continued renaissance of one part of town. I ran for the office for the exact opposite reason. I thought we need to continue that and to elevate it, but that my drive has been to get more attention and investment into those neighborhoods that have been traditionally left behind. And we now have a foundation and money that we've never had before.
Do you think that we can still avoid going the way of San Francisco and Seattle, where it seems that they've completely lost control?
Of course we can. And we must. You know, homelessness is tough in Sacramento, but it's not nearly as bad as in these other places. And our work is to make sure that we bend the curve the other way, but certainly to make sure that it doesn't get like that. And same with gentrification in general and affordable housing. That is why we intentionally set aside $100 million of this Measure U money through this bond that, again, was very controversial, to say we need a source of funding so that we can begin more aggressively building the types of housing that are going to be affordable to all people in Sacramento. And so, you know, I get up every day with that frame in my head. What are we doing to grow Sacramento? What are we doing to direct as much of that growth as possible into the neighborhoods? And what are we doing to address housing and homelessness?
And yet,
everything else.
I see on social media every day, what are we doing about homelessness? We're spending millions and millions of dollars on this, and it's been a major effort, and yet you still hear from some members of the public as if nothing is going on.
And you know what? I accept. Here's what I accept. I expect that people will not say thank you until they see the actual result and they feel that it's different. And that's okay with me. I don't mind being held accountable. I hope people will look at my entire record, will look to see the seeds that I am planting, and believe in this direction. And nothing I've ever done and nothing ever worth doing is easy.
So we've got to final thoughts at this point. So I have this question for you. So, assuming you run for re-election, and everyone knows you are, and you win, then one day in December of 2024, we'll all turn out to hear your swan song and your final address. And your efforts on homelessness will be a disappointment unless what happens between now and then?
Unless the numbers of chronically homeless people are less in Sacramento. And unless we have implemented and aggressively implemented a funded affordable housing strategy in Sacramento. I think those are the two tests.
And you think we'll see one day when people aren't sleeping in Cesar Chavez Park?
I don't know that we can cure the problem, Marcos. I think that would be folly for me. And I think that would be a politician, you know, putting out a good soundbite. No, I don't say we can cure it. And I don't know whether the homeless will ever not sleep at Cesar Chavez Park. But I continue to believe, and I think some of the early evidence shows it, that we can translate the hundreds we have gotten off the streets into thousands. And that with an aggressive housing strategy and a better partner at the state, and I think we have a better partner around housing issues with Governor Newsom, that we can avoid the plight of other cities in California and outside of California by ensuring that we have a range of affordable options for everyone who deserves to live in the city that we love.
And with that, I want to thank our special guest, Mayor Darrell Steinberg. I hope you found this to be worthwhile.
I sure did. I appreciate the opportunity.
It was an honor for us, and we thank you for watching. We encourage you to read the Sacramento Bee, sacbee.com, for all the news. I say this all the time to my friends and colleagues in television that I am happy to be here, and we are happy to be here to put out a morning paper that they can then duplicate in their evening news without giving us credit. And I'm trying to do that. So with that, I'm Marcos Breton, Sacramento Bee. Thank you for being with us.